December 8th, in Tokyo Bay, the air was thick with the smell of oil and celebration. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just struck Pearl Harbor a day earlier, and across the fleet's command decks, officers stood proud, convinced they had crippled America's ability to fight. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, standing aboard the Akagi, looked across the calm waters as the sun rose behind a line of destroyers returning from victory. The crews cheered. Japan's pilots had destroyed or damaged 8 American battleships, sunk or burned dozens of vessels, and annihilated hundreds of aircraft. But among the joyous noise, one man stood quiet. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the attack. He held a cigarette between his fingers, unlit, staring at the horizon. "We may have awoken a sleeping giant," he murmured, recalling Yamamoto's warning, words few around him cared to hear. Back in Washington, D.C., the mood couldn't have been more different. The shock of the Pearl Harbor attack had plunged the United States into mourning and fury. The smell of burning ships still hung over Oahu's waters. The Arizona lay bleeding oil into the sea, a grave for more than 1,000 men. And yet, in the war rooms of the U.S. Navy Department, while the country grieved, something else stirred. A question that would define the next 4 years of industrial warfare. How fast can we rebuild? Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence reports arrived in Tokyo weeks later. The U.S. Pacific Fleet crippled. Carriers Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga damaged or fleeing. Tokyo's newspapers printed headlines declaring Japan's inevitable dominance over the Pacific. What they didn't print, because no one knew yet, was that America's real weapon wasn't just steel or aircraft. It was industry. Deep in shipyards from San Francisco to Norfolk, a quiet mobilization had already begun. Thousands of workers poured in daily, welders and riveters replacing soldiers in uniform. Women who'd never touched machinery before now hammered, cut and shaped steel with precision. Blueprints for new classes of ships spread across drafting tables like battle plans. The Essex-class carriers, the Casablanca-class escort carriers. In less than 2 months after Pearl Harbor, the first hull plates were being laid. The United States wasn't rebuilding its fleet. It was reinventing how warships were made. In Japan, admirals toasted their victory. They believed America would need a decade to recover. They didn't know that by the time they launched their next offensive, the U.S. would already be launching new aircraft carriers. The war had shifted from the seas to the factories. And in this new kind of warfare, America was about to fight with machines, manpower, and momentum unlike anything the world had ever seen.
January 1942, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Virginia. Steam hissed through the frozen morning air. Sparks rained down as welders worked in rhythm, their faces hidden behind masks of firelight. The war had come to America, not with guns, but with hammers. Inside the shipyard office, Commander Arthur Robinson of the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships stared at a wall-sized chart. Every red pin marked a vessel sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. Half the Pacific Fleet was gone. The silence from those ships felt heavier than the winter air. But Robinson wasn't there to mourn. He was there to multiply. Behind him, civilian engineers and naval officers crowded around a new blueprint. Essex-class aircraft carrier Hull CV-9, a ship unlike anything built before. Larger deck space, heavier armor, more aircraft capacity, and, most importantly, designed for mass production. Robinson slammed his fist lightly on the table. "Gentlemen, this isn't about building ships one by one. It's about creating an assembly line for the sea." The challenge was monumental. Before the war, a single aircraft carrier took nearly 5 years to build. Now, the U.S. needed dozens, fast. Across the country, shipyards transformed overnight. In California, the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond became the beating heart of industrial warfare. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate with no naval background, promised he could build ships in months. Not years. People laughed. Then they watched in disbelief as his team launched the first Liberty ship in just 42 days. Soon, his techniques, modular assembly, round-the-clock shifts, and prefabrication were adapted for carriers. Giant hull sections were built separately, transported by rail, and welded together like puzzle pieces. It was the birth of speed-built warships. By mid-1942, the first Essex-class carriers began sliding into the water. The USS Essex, Yorktown, CV-10, Bunker Hill, and Intrepid. Behind them came smaller escort carriers, nicknamed baby flat tops. They were cheaper, faster, and could carry aircraft anywhere the fleet needed them. Every week, new hulls appeared at docks that had been empty months before. Workers cheered as flags rose on freshly painted decks, knowing each one meant another strike against the Axis. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japanese reconnaissance planes scouted American ports from afar, sending coded reports to Tokyo. Multiple large vessels under construction, identification uncertain. In Tokyo's Naval General Staff Office, Admiral Osami Nagano read the message and frowned. The Americans had no shipyards of that scale before the war. "How?" he muttered. "How are they building so many, so soon?" Japan's own shipyards, meanwhile, were straining. Scarce steel, bombed infrastructure, and a dwindling skilled workforce meant each Japanese carrier took years, not months. They still built them traditionally, by hand, with craftsmanship and ceremony. The Americans were now manufacturing carriers like trucks. Within a year of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had dozens of new carriers either at sea or under construction. The Pacific, once Japan's playground, began filling with American decks, each one brimming with Hellcats, Avengers, and dauntless dive bombers. And in intelligence briefings, Japanese commanders struggled to believe their own reports. How could a nation so broken at Pearl Harbor now launch more ships than Japan had ever built in its history? The answer lay not just in industry, but in unity. America's entire economy, from car factories to kitchen assembly lines, had turned into a war engine. Ford built B-24 bombers. General Motors produced tank engines. Women filled the shipyards, their hands rough and proud. Rosie the Riveter had become a symbol of total war. By late 1943, when the first major Pacific counteroffensives began, the Imperial Navy faced a nightmare they could no longer outfight or outbuild. The tide had turned, but the Japanese didn't yet realize just how completely it had.
October 1943, Tokyo, Japan. The conference room was dim, cigarette smoke curling toward the low ceiling. Around a polished mahogany table sat the senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Men whose crisp uniforms and iron expressions masked a creeping dread beneath. On the table lay a stack of reconnaissance photographs. American carriers, rows of them. The officers leaned in as one of the intelligence analysts spoke softly. "We believe these images were taken at Pearl Harbor and on the U.S. West Coast." Admiral Mainichi Koga, successor to the late Yamamoto, flipped through the photos with a deliberate calm. The camera had caught something impossible. New carriers lined up like an assembly line, their decks gleaming in the Hawaiian sun. "This must be deception," one officer said flatly. "The Americans are bluffing." "Perhaps," Koga replied. "But if this is no trick, then Japan is finished." For the first time since 1941, silence filled the room. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, now faced a storm it could neither outproduce nor outlast. Thousands of miles away, in the Pacific, that storm already raged. The USS Essex led a task force toward the Gilbert Islands. Its decks roared with the sound of aircraft engines warming up. F-6F Hellcats, TBF Avengers, and SB-2C Helldivers all lined up under the morning sun. On the flight deck, crewmen in color-coded vests sprinted across steel like clockwork, each man part of a vast mechanical rhythm. When the order came, dozens of aircraft leapt skyward. The sky turned alive with wings and thunder. The Essex wasn't alone. Behind her followed the Bunker Hill, Lexington,
Yorktown, and a dozen escort carriers, forming a wall of steel and air power that stretched across the horizon. Japan's scattered garrisons had never seen anything like it. The American fleet, which had once numbered in single digits, now seemed endless. When Japanese scouts reported carrier formations too large to count, Tokyo dismissed them as exaggerations, but as carrier after carrier appeared in battle in the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippine Sea, disbelief turned to panic. June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. From the bridge of the carrier Taiho, Admiral Jisaburo Osawa watched his pilots take off, their aircraft streaking toward the horizon. He had 400 planes, enough, he thought, to turn back the Americans. Hours later, radio silence. Then, static. Reports crackled in. Enemy carrier sighted. Many carriers. Too many! American radar picked them up hundreds of miles away. Hellcats swarmed from every direction, cutting through Japan's veteran pilots. The battle would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese planes destroyed in a single day. The true shock came afterwards. When reconnaissance planes returned to the U.S. fleet, they counted 15 American carriers operating together, more than Japan had ever deployed in total. And for every ship damaged, another waited, already on its way from a U.S. port. Back in Tokyo, Osawa's after-action report was grim. "We no longer fight a navy. We fight a factory." That sentence echoed through every level of Japan's command. The Americans had not just rebuilt their fleet, they had industrialized victory. What took Japan years of careful craftsmanship, America could replace in weeks. A lost carrier meant tragedy for Japan. For the U.S., it meant another order to the shipyards. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had launched over 100 carriers, a mix of fleet and escort types. Japanese naval diaries described it as a steel tide, endless and merciless. In every sense, it was true. The war that began with Japan's mastery of the seas had become a war of endurance, and America's industry had made sure Japan could not endure it. The carriers that once symbolized Japan's might were now burning across the Pacific, and in Washington, as new ships slid down their ways into the ocean, a quiet realization spread. The United States had built not just ships, it had built momentum. The war's outcome was no longer in question. Only the cost remained.
December 1944. Washington, D.C. The Capitol Dome glowed in the cold winter night. Inside the War Production Board's headquarters, maps, graphs, and production charts covered every wall. Rows of secretaries clattered at typewriters as officers read reports aloud. Numbers so large they hardly seemed real. 124 aircraft carriers completed. 45,000 aircraft produced this quarter. 17 million tons of shipping launched since January. Each statistic was another nail in the Axis coffin. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice, calm yet resolute, echoed through a radio broadcast that night. "This is the arsenal of democracy, and its power will not be stopped." Back in the Pacific, that power was visible on every horizon. The USS Enterprise, once a lone survivor from the early days of war, now sailed among a dozen new sisters: Hornet, Essex, Lexington, Wasp, Bunker Hill, and many more. The decks of these ships gleamed under the Pacific sun like a highway of steel. On one carrier, a young sailor named Thomas Green leaned over the railing watching waves crash against the hull. 2 years ago, he'd worked in an auto plant in Detroit. Now he was part of the greatest fleet in human history. He smiled as he spotted a line of escort carriers trailing behind the main fleet. "Looks like they're building these things faster than we can name them," he joked. His shipmate laughed. "Buddy, that's the whole point." And he was right. The Americans had turned the art of shipbuilding into a science. Welders, engineers, machinists, men and women alike had become the true warriors behind the front lines. In Richmond, California, a 20-year-old welder named Helen worked 12-hour shifts piecing together carrier decks. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, but when she heard that one of her ships helped win at Saipan, she cried with pride. Every rivet she placed carried the weight of freedom. Meanwhile, in Japan, the mood had turned grim. Factories were silent, shipyards were bombed, Fuel was scarce. The Kuri naval arsenal, once the pride of the empire, now stood half empty, its dry docks filled with the rusting remains of unfinished ships. Japanese officers flipped through new intelligence reports in disbelief. "The Americans have launched yet another class of carriers," one whispered. "Impossible," another muttered. "No," said an older admiral quietly, "inevitable." They had underestimated not just America's capacity, but its unity. Every town, every factory, every household had joined the fight. Housewives rolled bandages. Kids collected scrap metal. Car factories became tank factories. Shipyards never slept. This wasn't just war. It was mobilization on a scale the world had never seen. By 1945, the Pacific was an American ocean. Task Force 58, a massive carrier group, now had enough firepower to bomb Japan day and night without pause. When U.S. forces struck at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, wave after wave of carrier-based aircraft darkened the sky. The Japanese Navy barely existed anymore. Its last major ships, Yamato, Musashi, Shinano, were sunk before they could even make a difference. The same nation that had once stunned the world at Pearl Harbor was now reduced to defending its shores. And in one final irony, the Shinano, the largest carrier Japan ever built, was sunk by an American submarine before completing her first mission. A ship meant to symbolize rebirth became a tomb for 1,400 men. When word reached Tokyo, a weary naval officer closed his notebook and whispered, "They built 100. We could not even save one." August 1945, Tokyo Bay. The war was over. The battleships Missouri and Iowa anchored side by side as Japan's surrender was signed. Above the harbor, hundreds of aircraft circled, many of them launched from the same carriers that Japan once thought impossible to build so quickly. Those ships now stood as silent witnesses to the cost and the capability of industrial war. America's wartime miracle had stunned even its allies. From 1942 to 1945, the United States had launched over 100 aircraft carriers, more than all other nations combined. The feat wasn't just engineering, it was a statement that freedom, when fully mobilized, could outbuild tyranny. And as those massive carriers returned home, their decks scarred and sun-faded, the world realized something profound. The battle for the Pacific had been won not just by sailors and pilots, but by welders, riveters, and dreamers who believed the impossible could be built.